There comes a time in a franchise when it reaches success to where it branches out of its comfort zone, adopting different formats to reach different audiences. The same can be said about the Silent Hill franchise. From its humble beginnings that started on consoles, it would eventually weave its way into media such as movies, comics, and crossovers with other franchises. It may be common knowledge by now, especially if you are a Silent Hill fan, but you'd be surprised by how vast this media expands beyond what we already know. And not just by how many adaptations this franchise has adopted, but also, unfortunately, has become lost to time. This in particular would be the lost media of Silent Hill. Over the years, there have been dedicated forums and websites that underwent the discovery of various media about Silent Hill that has slowly been uncovered, albeit partially found, which gave us a look at graphic novels, and even games that were unbeknownst to many. After some extensive research, I discovered some lost media about the franchise that I found very interesting and want to talk about today. With the release of Silent Hill 1 on the PlayStation in 1999, it was met with overwhelming success, with over 1 million units sold and, at the time, the highest selling Silent Hill title in the franchise to date. Because of this, Konami would capitalize on this and warranted more marketing with their newest bestseller and IP. Initially, there would have been a promotional tie-in graphic novel simply titled Silent Hill. The graphic novel would have featured 70 pages, serving as an adaptation of the game's story. The publisher, Com.X, a publisher based in Europe, would publish the graphic novel. However, plans ended up falling through due to unknown reasons. In a DeviantArt post on February 19, 2007, the interior artist, Neil Gouge, proceeded to post never-before-seen artwork from the graphic novel itself. According to Neil, he states that before he was employed with the publisher Com.X, he was working with two guys at their own design company. He eventually landed the job and was employed to design the Silent Hill graphic novel for the next 6 months as the company landed the rights from Konami. Neil would spend the next 6 months designing the 70 pages of the graphic novel and eventually finished it. However, as we already know, the graphic novel never saw the light of day. Years later in 2001, a user on the Lost Media Wiki would personally contact Neil about the graphic novel in hopes of getting his inquiries regarding the reason for the cancellation. According to the user, he states in an email with Neil that the entirety of the 70 pages from the graphic novel was lost due to the project being stored on a CD, which was unfortunately not properly preserved and lost over the years. Neil then exclaims that the reason for the cancellation of the graphic novel was due to intercompany politics between Konami and its European branch, resulting in a fallout. Interestingly enough, Konami not only initially commissioned an adaptation of a Silent Hill graphic novel, but also a special edition to be packaged alongside it with an adaptation of Silent Hill 2. Quote, "We were commissioned by Konami Europe, I believe, to produce the comic as promotional material for Silent Hill 2. It was going to be published separately and in a special edition of the game. Konami Japan also wanted to use the comic. Konami Europe, who had paid for the project, wanted some sort of payment for that use from Konami Japan. Konami Japan refused to pay any kind of fee, so Konami Europe said that they couldn't use it. At which point Konami Japan, who technically owned all copyrights on Silent Hill, then blocked Konami Europe from releasing the book under usage rights, not getting proper permission, etc. Neil Gouge. With this revelation, we would end up getting only 5 pages that were lost, but fortunately found thanks to the help of Neil Gouge posting his artwork of the graphic novel on DeviantArt. The first page is the product catalog, which provides proof of the comic's existence. The next page is an illustration of presumably the puppet nurses and puppet doctors seen in Alchemilla Hospital. Next are illustrations of the opening nightmare sequence, which sees Harry exploring the alleyway up until he meets the Grey Childs. The next page shows what looks like a flashback of the aftermath of Dahlia Gillespie's ritual performed on her daughter, Alyssa Gillespie, which shows the reader the Gillespie household in flames with nearby townspeople witnessing the events, alongside firefighters carrying out a burnt and charcoaled Alyssa. The final page shows Harry Mason and Michael Kaufman meeting for the first time in Alchemilla Hospital, where we see Harry pleading to Kaufman to not shoot at him as he isn't one of the monsters. As of this time, these are the only 5 pages uncovered in regards to the Silent Hill graphic novel. In 2006, members from Team Silent, Hiroyuki Owaku and Masahiro Ito, created 2 Silent Hill comics titled Cage of Cradle and Double Under Dusk. Both comics were exclusive to Japan and released digitally on cell phones for a limited time only, although there were talks to eventually release print releases in both America and Japan, but this unfortunately never reached fruition. The comic, Silent Hill Cage of Cradle, serves as a prequel to Silent Hill 1, following the main protagonist called Matthew, the boyfriend of Lisa Garland, who later appears in Silent Hill 1 as a major character, In terms of its plot, there isn't much of an understanding to go off of, as much of the comic is lost, and what pages we do have been found and pieced together by fans, with a vague idea of its story. From what's been gathered, the story would have seen Matthew travel to Silent Hill to save Lisa from the Order, but due to the influence of Lesa's manifestations becoming active throughout the town, this sees Matthew transported to the other world. Matthew would witness the birth of Valtiel at some point and would abruptly die. Due to this, Lisa becomes enraged and blames Alessa for the death of Matthew, resulting in Lisa strangling Alessa. However, Valtiel would intervene and Lisa would die. She would later be reborn as a monster and wander the other world alone. The final chapter would end around the same time the opening sequence of Silent Hill 1 would take place. The comic, Double Under Dusk, follows Brian Dawson, a 40-year-old man who spends day-to-day in emotional and spiritual apathy ever since he lost his son, Ronnie. Brian eventually loses his job and divorces his wife. At some point, Brian meets Lindsay Crystal, a 20-year-old college student from Arano, Maine, who is majoring in folklore. Her studies bring her to Augusta to research a town called Silent Hill. As she puts it, a town where the dead return. This leads her to meet Brian in a library, to which Brian happens to recognize her as she closely resembles a woman he's seen in his nightmares. They decide to join together and both travel to Silent Hill, particularly to Lookalike Island, where much of the comic's location takes place. According to Masahiro Ito, he retains all the pages and original script for both Cage of Cradle and Double Under Dusk, although cannot release them to the public due to a contract with Konami. Because of this, the comics were eventually pulled from the now-defunct cell phone service to view the comics at the time, and have been partially lost. The only known images and references we have of these comics are posts from Masahiro Ito. After the release of Silent Hill 1, a lesser-known companion title would be released alongside it a couple of years later on the Game Boy Advance, exclusively in Japan, titled Silent Hill Play Novel. This was an adaptation of the original Silent Hill 1 on the PlayStation in terms of its narrative. However, there are a couple of substantial differences that separate it from its console counterpart, such as the gameplay adopting a visual novel format and the option to play as either Harry Mason or Sybil Bennett in their respective scenarios. However, the topic of interest that's most interesting in regards to this game is not necessarily the two main scenarios, but rather the DLC that was released afterward that's become quite a mystery over time. The third scenario featured a protagonist named Andy, a young boy who was a neighbor to both Harry and Cheryl Mason. Andy's story is broken into 4 chapters that correlate to 4 seasons: spring, summer, autumn, and winter. His first chapter, A Boy's Story Spring, would be released in May 2001 on the Game Boy Mobile Adapter. The Game Boy Mobile Adapter would be used to connect to the internet and download the data on the Game Boy Advance's internal memory. However, the flaw with this is that the downloaded chapter wouldn't be properly saved once the player powered off the console. Because of this, the chapters were never properly archived and the other chapters would become lost media. While we wouldn't exactly know what happens in the later chapters of Andy's scenario, we can get a valuable idea that much of his story would coincide with both Harry and Sybil's story. Cheryl Mason would also play a significantly larger role in his scenario. In Sybil's scenario, Andy makes a brief cameo when Sybil finds him drowning in an aqueduct, where she proceeds to save him. Afterward, Andy then proceeds to attack Cheryl and blames her for pushing him into the aqueduct. Sybil attempts to stop Andy and defuse the situation, but later becomes unconscious. With the Silent Hill Play Novel official guidebook, we can find a page that allows the player to see a couple of screenshots of in-game renders, alongside a story flowchart in Japanese text that elaborates in detail on the first chapter of Andy's scenario in spring. When translated into English, the scenario sees Andy as the Mason's neighbor who has a crush on Cheryl Mason. They attend the same school together. However, Andy hasn't mustered the courage to express his feelings for her. When Andy decides to finally profess his feelings to Cheryl, both Harry and Cheryl happen to travel to Silent Hill, which sees Andy sneak into the back of Harry's Jeep to hitch a ride with them. After Harry's crash and Cheryl's disappearance, Andy wanders into Silent Hill alone to find her. The spring chapter has 2 endings. The first ending sees Andy staring into a large chasm, fearing that Cheryl fell into it and would be unable to help her. He then hears someone approaching him, presumably Alessa Gillespie, but he cannot move to see who it is as his body is unable to move to see who is behind him. In the second ending, Andy reaches the chasm to lament about Cheryl falling into it. He then proceeds to step forward and fall into the chasm, unable to move once he falls to the bottom. As of this point in time, we have no further information about Andy's scenario, and that is the lost media of Silent Hill. It's quite amazing how such media like this has been slowly uncovered over the years thanks to hard work and dedication to the Silent Hill community that allows us to not only see such content that is obscure and a rarity to witness, but also properly preserved and archived for years to come, at least what's left of it. It's truly unfortunate that most of this media is partially lost and incomplete, but hopefully, as we move forward, there's that small glimmer of hope that we can see full restoration of this content one day. Until then, I guess we have to wait and see. Anyways, that's me. Thank you for watching, please have a great day, stay safe, and goodbye.